In a town forgotten by time, where trouble rides in with the wind and legends fade slower than scars, Sorrel Greer learned to measure the day by the sounds of hooves and the smell of hay. Lark Ridge had once pretended at bustle, freight wagons on the rutted street, a bell that could rouse even the most stubborn sleepers for worship or warning. Lately, it was quieter than was decent for a place with a church, a schoolhouse, and a livery. Quiet could be kindness. Quiet could also be emptiness wearing its Sunday hat. Sorrel lived behind the livery, in a narrow room that borrowed its heat from the animals and its dignity from her stubbornness. The room was just wide enough for a cot, a washstand with a cracked bowl, and the tin trunk she'd brought from the Greer homestead when Reeves was still alive and the child inside her wasn't yet heavy enough to change the way she breathed. She kept the trunk latched, though there was little in it worth stealing: 2 linen shirts that had been his, a wedding ribbon, a small packet of letters that smelled faintly of smoke and sage. She told herself she kept it shut to keep out dust. The truth was, she wasn't ready to let the past wander around her room as if it had any rights left. Wind found every gap. In March, it prowled like a cat, teasing until the very notion of walls felt like a joke. Today, the wind had a hard edge, a rattle that set the stalls talking to one another. The horses were uneasy. Nettle, gray with moon dapples and a temperament as plain as spring water, shifted from hoof to hoof, then pinned her ears and nudged Sorrel with a long, whiskered muzzle. "I know," Sorrel said, pressing a palm to the mare's forehead. The animal's skin twitched beneath her touch. "You feel it too." A pressure lived in the air, as if the sky were a hand closing to a fist. She felt it behind her eyes and at the base of her skull. She felt it deep in her hips where the child had begun making small, deliberate signs that they were through with waiting. She'd woken that morning already pacing, and she'd never stopped. Sweep the aisle, shake fresh straw into the foaling stall, check the bucket rims for rust, fold the stack of torn sheets that would serve as clean cloths for the mare, and perhaps for herself. She boiled water in the soot-stung iron kettle the livery kept for such tasks, though the stove in the tack room coughed and sulked and made her coax flame out of it like an apology. By noon, a bruised dark horizon had risen in the southwest. Greenish, wrong. Sorrel stepped to the livery's big doors and leaned an arm against the upright, breathing the smell of old wood, manure, and linseed oil. On Main Street, such as it was, shutters winked shut like eyelids. Mr. Prouse hurried past with a crate of biscuits and his hat cinched down, pretended not to see Sorrel at all. He didn't forgive easily. He didn't forgive ever. Not since Reeves had died owing him $12 in change for flour and nails. "Afternoon, Miss Sorrel," called a voice she would rather not have heard. Deputy Clegg Barrett, a man with knuckles for teeth and an appetite for being seen in a badge. He planted himself in the middle of the road as if he meant to root. "You hear the bell if it rings." "I hear fine," she said. "Good. The town board said if the sky goes wicked, you take shelter at the schoolhouse root cellar. That livery's a tinderbox, and it's town property, don't forget." Sorrel bit her bottom lip once to keep words leaping out that she might later have to swallow. "I'll do what needs doing." Barrett smiled the way a terrier smiles at a mouse hole. "Do that!" He tipped the brim of his hat with a finger that never quite touched felt and walked on, spurs making a mean music. She watched him until he was a blot at the edge of town, then shut the livery doors against the jittering light. Inside, the air was warmer, but no less unsettled. Dust motes swam like minnows. Sorrel walked the length of stalls, speaking to each horse as she passed. Their names steadied her: Nettle, Moss, Cinder, Huckle, Blue. Moss, the old gelding with knees like barrels, pressed his weight into the rail and groaned, theatrically mournful. "You'll outlive us all, Moss," she scratched between his eyes. The first hard cramp came as a clean, clenched ache that made her stop and spread her hands on her thighs, lowering herself enough that her knees unlocked. She breathed through it, eyes closed, counting the wheel spokes in the wagon in the corner until the pain let go and the world slid back into focus. "Early yet," she whispered to the child. "You wait until the rain comes." Her mother had said that was the way of it with storm babies. They rode the pressure down until the clouds busted. Sorrel didn't know if it was science or superstition. She only knew the ache had a timetable of its own. Nettle blew out a breath that smelled of hay and patience. The mare's belly had dropped, her tail lifted, a string of clear fluid roped down and broke, shining on straw. "All right," Sorrel said, rolling up her sleeves. "One at a time, you and me. We'll do this decent." She fetched the stack of boiled rags and the jar of carbolic. She ripped fresh twine with her teeth and laid out the scissors. Thunder stumbled along the far hills, testing its voice. When the next pain climbed her spine and sat behind her ribs, Sorrel braced herself on the half-door of Nettle's stall and breathed like she'd been taught. In for 4, out for 6. Turn the breath into a rope she could hold on to. Reeves had laughed the first time she practiced the counting with him, then kissed her temple, then whispered numbers against her hair each night, until the practice became more than superstition. "You're a clever woman," he'd say, as if cleverness was a room she could unlock any time. His voice lived in the rafters sometimes, caught in the splinters where the light snagged. "Don't," she told herself. Memory was a treacherous sort of light. It made everything look warmer than it had been. Better to look at the animal in front of her. Nettle heaving, Nettle stamping, Nettle's eyes widening as a wave passed through her body and left her neck slick with sweat. She slid a hand into the birth canal, gentle but sure. The mare grunted. "Good girl, I'm here." The hoof she felt was small, hard within its soft capsule, another hoof beside it soon after. 2 feet. Proper. She searched for the nose and found it tucked where it ought to be. Relief unfurled inside her like a sheet snapping on a clothesline. "All right then, little one, come on." A different wind found the livery, one with a voice like a saw blade. It curled beneath the doors and combed the straw with cold fingers. The hair on Sorrel's arms lifted. She glanced toward the tack-room stove, sulking, its iron belly cooling, and for the first time since morning she wondered if the schoolhouse cellar would be smarter than stubbornness. The bell answered her. It did not ring for worship, or for fire, or for any ordinary thing. It took up a frantic language that made the horses throw their heads and lightning try on the street like a sash. Tornado. The word lived under the town's tongue, seldom spoken, taught to children as you teach them not to touch the iron. Nettle bore down. Sorrel braced her hand beneath the foal's jaw and drew in time, firm and merciful, as the mare's body opened like a door that had stuck all winter. The foal slid into her hands with a stubborn sort of grace, all shin and slick hide and wonder. Sorrel stripped the membrane from its nose. It sneezed and shook its folded ears. She laughed out loud, an untidy, cracked laugh that surprised her by being fierce. "Hello," she said, wiping fluid from the foal's mouth with her forearm when the rag slipped. "Welcome to a world that can be mean and beautiful in the same breath." Another cramp seized her. This one had teeth. She caught the stall rail. "Not yet," she grated between clenched molars. "Give me a minute to get the baby to milk, would you?" The livery doors banged once, twice, as if someone had run against them. She wiped her hands on her skirt and went to the bolt. When she slid it back, the doors shoved at her with a rude urgency. Wind tried to shoulder its way in. Beyond the gap, the street had gone a color that made her think of sickness, the green of a bruise when it's almost done healing and not yet healed. Dust jittered in eddies. A figure leaned into the current, hat dragged low, coat flung back by the blow of air.
"Stable?" the figure called. The voice was a roughened baritone, not young, the syllables filed down by travel and not from this county. The stranger lost his footing, then caught it again and put a shoulder to the door as if he had a right to. "I'm not running a hotel," Sorrel said, or tried to. The wind made nonsense of most words. "I can pay," he shouted. "Or work. Just let me get out of this." His hands on the door were dark with old soot, or old work, or both. The bell hammered. The green sky had lowered, its edges puckered and curled. The sound the wind made now was not a saw blade. It was a train with nowhere to go. "Fine," Sorrel said, and pulled. The door took the opportunity to leap inward, bringing the stranger with it. He stumbled 2 steps into the livery's dim belly and put his palms on his knees, the way men do when they are measuring out the next breath. Up close, he was taller than she'd thought, with the kind of height that had grown by inches in the night and never quite settled on what to do with itself. He might have been 30 or 40. His face wore what time had given it and asked for nothing. His eyes were the unsettled blue of a river in spring. He took off his hat and brought with it a little weather, then scrubbed the wet from his hair with the same hand. "Name's Ivor Vale," he said, as if a name were a gift you could set on a shelf. He looked from Sorrel to the stalls and back, quick and cataloguing. "You're alone." She didn't like that he said it like a fact rather than a question. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knows how to brace a door and how to keep a fire." He shifted the pack on his shoulder, and for the first time she noticed it wasn't only a bedroll and a bundle of tools. A small, scarred clay pot rode in a sling at his hip, lidded and roped as if it were a living thing. It breathed a whisper of heat that she felt from 2 steps away. Nettle blew, low and insistent. In the foaling stall, the new foal struggled up on trembling legs and promptly went down again as if the world had been too much too soon. Sorrel's abdomen clenched hard, enough to paint stars at the edges of her sight. She caught the post. "You're laboring," Ivor said, voice gone quiet. The moment fined down to a single bright thread between them. "I don't require commentary," Sorrel managed. "You require heat," he said, already moving, "and water kept warm, and light that doesn't blow out when the walls start to breathe." He went to the sulking tackroom stove, squatted and cracked the door with 2 fingers. It wheezed a dead smell. Ivor's mouth tilted, not quite a smile. He set his pack down, untied the rope on the clay pot, and pried its lid off with his thumbnail. The smell that came out was the oldest thing the world makes: char and wood smoke and the breath of yesterday. Sorrel's skepticism was a habit that had served her well. It flared now on instinct, then softened against a different instinct entirely, the one that made her put her hand on a horse's neck and know when it would bolt, or put her hand on a child's brow and know when fever had decided to leave. The heat from the pot was real and clean, banked coals tucked to sleep beneath ash. Ivor breathed on them like a man greeting a friend. He fed them a wick of charcloth that drank the ember and then blossomed into a jewel of red. With a twist of his wrist, he nested the jewel into tinder and coaxed it to life with slow air from his lungs. Flame rose, nimble, hungry, as if relieved to be recognized. He spoke to it, not words so much as sounds a man makes when he is doing a thing that matters and doesn't need an audience. He slid the fire into the stove's belly, where it caught with a stubborn grip, and then began to purr. "You carry that everywhere?" Sorrel asked, half to ignore the next contraction, half because curiosity had its own courage. "It's carried me," he said. "Some winters it was the only thing that remembered what warmth felt like. I learned from iron men and old women how to keep a coal alive 100 miles, learned to bank it so it never quite forgets." He nodded to the pot. "It's from a kiln that fell down on itself. Holds heat like a grudge." He stood, and the room changed, even before the heat could move. Standing, he seemed not bigger but steadier. He rolled his sleeves to the elbow, revealing forearms written with small burns and scars that had the tidy look of paid-for lessons. "Show me the water, and where you keep clean cloth." "I can—" Sorrel's voice thinned because her body had its own language and spoke it without asking. The contract took the middle of her and replaced it with a humming, insistent pressure. She breathed and counted and remembered Reeves' mouth shaping numbers at her ear. The taste of iron washed her tongue. When the wave released, it left her with seams, as if she were stitched together and the thread had a mind to snap. She swallowed. Tack room. The rags are there. Carbolic on the shelf. Kettle is by the pump. Ever moved as if he already knew the room, efficient, unconcerned with impressing anyone. He pumped water with one hand while the other set the kettle on the waking stove. The little stove wanted to sulk out of habit. He hummed to it until it remembered its purpose. He checked the seams around the big doors and hauled a heavy feed bin to brace them. He dragged the old wagon from the corner and levered it in place against the side door, where the latch had always been a suggestion rather than a promise. The bell's voice changed. It lost clarity and gained speed, became a hammer without a hand. The horses' whites sharpened around their eyes. Moss, old and honest enough to tell the truth, whickered something that was almost a prayer. "I should go," Sorrel said, the words feeling false the moment they left her. "The schoolhouse." "Maybe," Ever said, testing a beam with his weight, then wedging a plank beneath it so its sag had a counter-argument. "Or maybe the worst place to try running is in a wind that's looking for anything stupid enough to be outside. Better to make what's here strong and low. Can you walk?" "I can do more than that." When the next cramp hit, she did not move. She leaned into it with the bone logic of a woman whose body knew what to do, even if her mind wanted to negotiate. "Good," he said. And in that single word was not kindness and not command, but something truer, recognition. "The mare?" "Foal's on the ground, needs help to teat." "Then we'll help 2 babies today." He examined the foal with a glance that didn't pretend to be expertise. "You do the knowing, I'll do the lifting." He slid the foal's chest into the cradle of his hands, careful, and rocked it near the udder while Sorrel guided the slip fumble of the newborn's mouth. The foal latched, startled by its own success, then nursed like it invented the idea. Sorrel laughed that cracked, fierce laugh again. The sound steadied her. Some part of her unclenched that had been clenched since Reeves had gone under the saw and the sky had gone blank with the news. She rested her palm on Nettle's rump, felt the mare's big, practical heart laboring away. "Good girl," she told them both. The wind shoved at the walls, the stove breathed deeper as if drawing breath from the same lung as the storm. Ever banked the fire with an instinct that made the heat last longer than it should, slid a second kettle on and set the clay pot near the stove as if it too needed warming. He salted a low shelf with stubby candles he pulled from his pack and lit 3. The light they made wasn't pretty, but it behaved. "The deputy said the livery is town property. He likes to remind me of what belongs to me and what doesn't." "Walls belong to whoever's inside them when the wind is wrong. So does the fire." "And when the wind is done being wrong?" "Then we see who shows up to claim what survived." Sorrel snorted. "You sound like you've lived where the weather makes people honest." "I've lived where it makes them something anyway." He tied his hair back with a strip of leather and did it without bothering to smooth flyaways. "Where did you learn horses?" "From being poor. Another contract. This one dropped low like a trapdoor and surprised her with its urgency. She bent over the saddle stand and moaned, a small, contained sound that embarrassed her and relieved her in the same breath. When they lifted her head again, there were tears at the edges of her eyes, and she didn't apologize for them. "I'm from being poor, and from wanting quiet animals that didn't lie. Wanting to be inside something that depended on me and didn't run from it."
He nodded. "Then you learned them for the right reasons." The room had changed colors. It wasn't only the candles and the stove. It was the way light moved when the world outside was thinking dangerous thoughts. The aisle between stalls became a river of shadow and glow. Dust hung like a veil. The bell stutter-stopped. The air took on a listening gin of its own. Sorrel recognized the silence that followed, thin and bright as a blade.
She had been a child the last time the sky had done this. Her mother had pushed her beneath the bed and said, "Pretend the floor above you was made for holding." Her mother had made everything sound like practice for something else. "Down," Ivor said, and though his voice was quiet, it brooked no argument. "We go low. Where's the crawl space?" "There isn't one, just the footing trench at the back wall." "Then that's where we live for a little while." He grabbed the 2 thickest blankets from the cot in Sorrel's narrow room and spread one in the trench. He made a small mountain of the other beside it. "We pack straw on the windward side. You'll get splinters, and the straw will pick fights with your hair. Better that than flying glass." Sorrel glanced at Nettle. The mare had settled into licking the foal with such total attention that she might never notice a war breaking out. Moss pressed his forehead to the slats like a penitent. Huckle was trying to disappear into the corner of his stall and had almost succeeded. "They'll panic." "They'll live," Ivor said. "If the roof goes, they'll be freer than we are." He caught her looking at the stove. "We keep that fire. If we come up and there's nothing else, we still have heat." He set the clay pot and a shovel beside the trench with the air of a man setting a table. A draft slid through the room and lifted the hair on Sorrel's neck like cold fingers. She swayed. The contraction took her with both hands and bent her toward the floor. Ivor's hand was there, not touching, but offering. When she grabbed it, he didn't squeeze too hard or too soft. He was a hinge, not a drag. Don't count, just breathe and look at something that won't move. She fixed her eyes on the iron ring set in the wall by the hitch rail. It had been there longer than she'd been in Larkridge. It would outlast her by quiet moons. She breathed its stubbornness into her own lungs and rode the wave that her body had summoned. When she surfaced, she was sweating and angry at the effort and grateful for the anger. Ivor's hand left hers and went to the kettle. He poured hot water into the basin, checked it with the inside of his wrist, with the economy of someone who had been scalded enough times to have learned. He tore a sheet into narrower strips with methodical neatness. He didn't look away when her body made complaints that most men pretended not to hear. He didn't try to name anything that was already named. Another sound threaded through the wind, not the bell. A low animal moan that didn't end when it should have. The horses wove in their stalls. The walls of the livery flexed and sighed. "Now," said Ivor quietly, "we go down." "Wait!" Sorrel was halfway to arguing when the world made the decision for her. The doors breathed inward all at once and then snapped back like lips over teeth. Noise turned to a thing you could eat and choke on. The roof above them went from wood to sail and then to something that wanted very much to be somewhere else. Ivor's arm was around her before she understood she'd started to fall. He ferried her to the trench and lowered her onto the blanket. The trench wasn't deep, just enough to make a midwife of the earth. He piled the second blanket over her legs and hips, then wedged straw against the windward side until it felt like being inside the ribs of a patient animal. "Keep low," he said. "If I say now, you cover your head with both arms and don't look up, no matter what you hear. Can you do that?" Yes, which was not obedience so much as agreement with the logic of survival. She reached for him. "Don't go far." "I'm not going," he said, without looking back. He moved like a man convinced that motion itself could nail the livery to the ground. He threw his weight against the big doors until the braces groaned and consented to hold. He kicked the side door latch into place with an accuracy that would have made a better man proud. He slid the shovel under the stove, scooped a bright clutch of coals into the clay pot, and capped them quickly, then fed the stove fresh wood with both hands as if the fire were a citizen worth defending. Sorrel felt her body decide to have the baby. There was no ceremony in it, no waiting for permission. The pressure bore down like the sky had settled into her bones. She grabbed the edges of the blanket and tore a strip with her teeth just to have something to do other than cry out. She didn't want to frighten the horses, which was a ridiculous thought and the truest she'd had all day. "Ivor," she said, and did not recognize her own voice. He was there, sliding to his knees, his shoulder a wall at her back. "I've got you. We'll do this the way you do everything, one good breath at a time." He set the basin within reach, the rags, the carbolic. He washed his things without hurry. He spoke low, the way one speaks to a skittish animal and to the part of a woman's body that believes only what it has seen. "You tell me what you need, and I'll be what you need." The sound the sky made now devolved into something with no edges, a rope of noise that went on and on. Sorrel pushed when the urge took her, rested when it fled. The earth bucked under the livery. A rain of straw and splinters pattered the blanket. Once, a board ripped free from somewhere above and sailed past like a dark bird, close enough that she felt its wake across her cheek. Ivor covered her head with his forearm and did not flinch when the board clipped his sleeve and took a thread of skin with it. She bore down, and the world narrowed to the place between her hips, a ring of fire becoming a door, becoming a road. She breathed the iron ring in the wall. She breathed the heat of the fire. She breathed Ivor's voice, counting things that didn't need counting, but made a rhythm she could follow. The boards along the stall, 1, 2, 3, 4. The nails in the post, 1, 2, 3. The straw bales, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each number turned into a step towards something that frightened her less than being stuck. The child who had made a home inside her and now wanted a different room.
"Head," Ivor said, wonder threaded through the syllable. "You're crowning. It's right there. Breathe through this one, then we'll ride the next one down." She wrote it. The pain was a clean fire, and she was the iron being tempered. She breathed. She did not break. The next wave climbed, and she bore down with a sound that was not screaming and not singing, but some cousin to both. The head came, a slippery burden that became a blessing at once. She felt shoulders turn beneath her, a cleverness her body remembered better than her mind ever could. "Almost," Ivor said, not in triumph or pity, but in simple acknowledgement of a thing about to happen. He set his hands where they needed to be and no place else. "With me, one more." The wall at the north end of the livery flexed in, then out like a chest trying to breathe underwater. A new noise entered the room, lower, crueler, threaded with debris striking debris. The candles went out in a single gust, like a hand had pinched their lives closed. The stove's door banged and threw a handful of sparks into air that had turned greedy. "Now," Ivor said, and Sorrel gave the last of herself to the push. The infant slid in a rush that left her feeling emptied and vast. For a moment, the world was just after. The noise braided itself into the background of that moment, the way rain braids itself into sleep. Sorrel felt the cord pulsing against her thigh, hot and holy. Ivor lifted the child and cleared its nose with 2 fingers and a firm stroke. He rubbed its back with a rough cloth, as if polishing a miracle. "Come on," he whispered, not begging, not pleading, calling. "Come on, little Cole, catch." The baby's mouth opened. The baby's chest trembled. No sound came. The room lurched. A support at the far corner failed with a crack like a verdict. The north wall shuddered outwards and then began to peel away in a sheet. Wind took the ragged edge and worried at it with feral teeth. Through the opening, Sorrel saw the funnel, close enough to be a thing and not a story, a column of bruised silk chewing the ground and spitting it skyward. It was elegant in the way a scythe is elegant, designed for one purpose and very good at it. The funnel's edge licked at the livery, searching for an excuse. Sparks leapt from the stove's open mouth, seized by the draft, and skittered toward the open wound in the wall. In the same glance, Sorrel saw 3 truths. The infant in Ivor's hands did not yet cry. The fire was about to go where it could not be allowed to go, and the wall would be gone in another breath, taking with it anything not clutched, not weighted, not willed into staying. "Cover!" Ivor barked, but he did not reach for his own head. He had the child in his palms and the stove behind him, spitting light like birdshot. "Go!" Sorrel shouted over the riot. Her voice tore itself to pieces and still found him. "Save the fire. If the place goes, we'll need—" He looked at her, and in his face she saw the sort of arithmetic a life can be made from. Heat against cold, breath against absence, one flame against the hunger of a ruin. He didn't look at the wall again. He didn't look at the stove. He set the child belly down across his forearm, cocked 2 fingers along the jaw, and swept. Once, twice, firm, as if calling a reluctant coal back from ash. The infant's mouth opened wider. The infant's chest hitched. The room seemed to hold its ragged breath. The wall tore free. Wind grabbed and hauled. The stove spat an armful of sparks that streaked toward open air, became stars, then turned into knives. The clay pot with its banked ember teetered on the trench's edge as the ground bucked. A voice, someone outside, impossibly close, cut through everything, raw with fear and authority. "Sorrel!" it screamed. "Sorrel Greer!" The name ripped through her like a second birth. She flung an arm toward the voice without seeing who owned it. Ivor took a breath that was also an oath and bent to put his mouth over the child's. The funnel leaned. The ember pot slid. The baby was still silent when the door exploded inward and a shadow filled the opening with a gun leveled and rain running off a coat. The muzzle swung toward Ivor's head like a judgment. "Don't move," the shadow bellowed. "Drop that child." Sorrel tried to sit, to rise, to be larger than she was. The livery groaned, the ember teetered, the world chose a direction, and it wasn't a kind one. The baby took a breath. So tiny, so brave, she almost didn't hear it. A squeak, the most beautiful wrong note in the world. Ivor didn't flinch. He turned that sound into a cry with a rub along the small spine and a thump of encouragement. The funnel's mouth kissed the eaves. The shadow's finger tightened on the trigger. The ember pot tipped. And the fire? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you.
Caught. Not the flimsy flirt of a candle, not the greedy leap of a lantern knocked to the floor, but a steadier, older thing. Heat remembering itself in a world determined to forget. The clay pot rocked on the edge of the trench. Ivor's boot trapped it there with a swift, precise press as his other hand lifted the newborn, and the room decided whether it wanted to stay a room. The shadow in the doorway became a man when lightning gave him a face. Deputy Clegg Barrett, hat jammed down, rain running off the brim in ropes, gun leveled with the sort of obedience that didn't ask whether it had picked the right target. "Drop that child!" he roared, as if the storm needed coaching. Sorrel's throat tore a no out of itself that felt bigger than she was. She could see the whole of the scene from an impossible distance and from inside her own skin at once. Ivor's cheeks slick with rain where the weather had ridden in on his coat. The angry mouth of the stove coughing sparks that the wind tried to foster into mischief. The north wall turning from wood to idea to nothing. The baby answered none of it. The baby was the quiet center, the held breath, a mouth opening like a small, uncertain blossom. Ivor didn't flinch at the barrel aimed between his eyes. He tilted the infant belly down along his forearm and swept 2 fingers along the jaw the way a man might coax flame out of a stubborn coal. He rubbed the small back with a firm, loyal rhythm. "Come on," he said, in a voice that made the world lean closer to hear. "Catch. This is how it's done." The child took air, fragile as spider silk, one thin thread, and then it broke. No cry yet. The thread trembled, respun, thinned. Sorrel felt the want of it like a hand closing around her own lungs. Barrett's gun cracked. The shot didn't land where he'd meant it. The door sucked at his arm as the pressure swung like a fist. The bullet chewed a splinter out of the hitch beam and went on to break a bottle that would have been unimportant any other day. The sound of glass was a bright insult in the throat of the wind. Ivor didn't spare at his eyes. He tucked the infant closer, put his mouth over the tiny mouth, and gave a breath that wasn't panic and wasn't prayer. Another rub. 2 beats. There you are. The baby found voice. It came out raw and indignant, and not at all certain that living was a good bargain, and it was the most beautiful sound Sorrel had ever been hurt by. The cry arrived in waves, thin, then stronger, then strong enough to shove back the storm a finger's width. In the small ribs beneath Ivor's palm, life took hold and looked around like it had questions. The world made room for that answer. The funnel's lips skimmed the ease and moved on like a giant who'd changed his mind. The wind stepped down a rung on the ladder of its rage. The north wall, robbed of its enemy, sagged and considered collapse. The stove's door banged open and a fistful of sparks leapt for the wound in the wall, freedom, ruin, and were hauled back in a glitter as Ivor slammed the door with his knee. "Clag," Sorrel said, her voice hoarse and iron together, "if you point that gun at him again, you'd better start running now and never stop." Barrett's gaze slashed from her to Ivor to the sucking seam of the wall. His jaw worked. "Town property," he shouted back at nothing in particular and everything at once, "and vagrancy is a crime. He ain't authorized to be anywhere near—" "Near saving my child's breath?" Sorrel's laugh came out of something sharper. "Put the gun down, or put it to use on the wind. See which listens." Barrett didn't lower it because she asked. He lowered it because he realized no one was watching him to be impressed. Even the storm had stopped taking direction. The gun rose again when pride remembered itself, and then chickened out and went halfway down as if undecided where it belonged. He swallowed. "Ma'am," he said, tacking respect onto the word like a sprig of holly on a coffin. "Ma'am, you need to come to the schoolhouse cellar. That livery's—" The livery's roof answered for itself with a groan and a shrug. A rafter split and dropped like a tired arm. Moss whickered a hymn. Huckle tried to climb his own stall wall and ran out of height. "Too late for cellars," Ivor said, calm as a man noting the weather. He had the child laid along Sorrel's bare stomach now, the cord still pulsing like a prayer between worlds. He'd thrown his coat over them both, not fussing to be modest, only to be warm. "We forded up here. We stay." "Get out of my way," Barrett snapped, as if he'd remembered what he'd come for. "Town board'll have my badge if I don't secure this property, and that vagrant—" Sorrel's body surged into something new. Afterpirth, the old women called it, as if the event itself were a kinsman who always arrived late and demanded attention. She gritted her teeth and breathed through it, hand anchored in Ivor's sleeve as if that fabric, those threads, knew things about staying. The cord slackened. Ivor tied it with boiled twine in 2 neat places, his fingers sure without rushing, and handed her the scissors. "Your work," he said, and did not make ceremony of it. She cut. The child yowled, insulted by the bureaucracy of being born. Sorrel gathered the small body up and pressed it to her chest where heat had learned to be useful. Barrett watched it all as if forced. His face couldn't decide how to arrange itself. Disgust, awe, calculation, fear? In the end, calculation won by thumb's width. "I'll be back with men," he said, retreat already stiff in his knees. "Board'll condemn this place. We're not paying to rebuild what you refuse to keep safe, and that vagrant—" Sorrel's body surged into something new. Afterpirth, the old women called it, as if the event itself were a kinsman who always arrived late and demanded attention. She gritted her teeth and breathed through it. hand anchored in Ivor's sleeve as if that fabric, those threads, knew things about staying. The cord slackened. Ivor tied it with boiled twine in 2 neat places, his fingers sure without rushing, and handed her the scissors. "Your work," he said, and did not make ceremony of it. She cut. The child yowled, insulted by the bureaucracy of being born. Sorrel gathered the small body up and pressed it to her chest where heat had learned to be useful. Barrett watched it all as if forced. His face couldn't decide how to arrange itself. Disgust? Awe? Calculation? Fear? In the end, calculation won by thumb's width. "I'll be back with men," he said, retreat already stiff in his knees. "Board'll condemn this place. We're not paying to rebuild what you refuse to keep safe. And that vagrant," he jabbed the air with his gun to finish the sentence, and then seemed startled his hand still had a firearm and holstered it like it embarrassed him. "That stranger, coming with me. You bring a rope," Sorrel said, voice flat with the cold iron of perfectly clear promise, "and it better be for hauling beams. If it's for anything else, you'll learn that the quietest woman in town knows exactly how to make noise." He scoffed and backed away, a crab pretending to be a wolf. The door grabbed at him, tried to keep him, and then let him out with a slap of wet. Silence didn't so much return as remember its duties. The storm moved on, gnashing its teeth at someone else. The livery settled, bruised and breathing. The candles, those that still had wicks, guttered and tried to stand up straighter. The stove's purr lost its rattle and found a steadier voice. Sorrel met the child. They looked like a new idea and old truth at the same time. Wrinkled, furious, impossibly specific. Eyes sealed still, lashes damp and ridiculous. "Hello, Cole," she whispered without meaning to, stealing Ivor's word because it was the right one. "You stubborn spark." Ivor's mouth tilted. "Haven't seen a baby that wasn't stubborn. Even the easy ones fight to arrive." He sat back on his heels, and only then did she see the thin slick of blood on his sleeve where the board had kissed him, the plank burn along his forearm, the scuff across his cheekbone where the door had gotten personal. He seemed entirely unconcerned with the inventory. He reached without asking and pulled the blanket higher over Sorrel's hips. "Cold?" "No," she said, and realized she was lying. The cold had crept in, not the storm's wicked cold, but the honest kind that follows work. He fed the stove and set bricks on its back like eggs in a nesting box. "Hold this one when it's warm," he said, as if conversation were a tool. "It helps after." He didn't say after what. He didn't have to. His hands were occupied in simple, necessary things, washing the blood from his palms, folding the rags he could salvage for later, retying the knot on the clay pot so it could ride heat with them when they needed to carry it. Nettle, unaffected by human politics, had nursed her foal into a doze and now—
"Seems you keep more than one thing alive." Sorrel rubbed the infant's back. The baby made a sound like a small, opinionated bird. "Not a healer," Ivor said, as if that cleared the record. "Just a man who knows where to put hands when breath's decided to be stubborn." He cut his eyes toward her, not quite a question and not quite leaving it alone. "You lost a lot of blood?" "I've lost more from words spoken wrong in the mercantile," she said. It was bravado, and he knew it. He didn't press. He placed the warmed brick in a swaddled towel and slid it against her hip. The heat crawled into her sore bones with grateful feet. She sighed without planning to, and he looked relieved in a quiet, private way. The town came back in pieces. A boy ran past, bareheaded and amazed to be alive, and stopped dead to press his hands to the livery doors, as if he could discover whether the building had a pulse. Mr. Prowse stood in the street with his hat in his hands, looking at the gouge the funnel had carved out of the schoolyard fence like a man looking at a mortally insulted pie. Miss Dunn, spine straight enough to hold up a faulty roof, counted children and counted them again until the number agreed with itself. The bell's rope hung limp and very interested in the ground. Barrett returned with 2 men and a sense of purpose that looked borrowed. One man was the blacksmith Roland Tauk, shoulders like a plow and eyes the color of hickory smoke. The other was town boardman Irv Prouse himself, expression pinched as a clothespin. Barrett pushed the door and stopped when it pushed back. Ivor had braced it with the feed bin and the stubborn remains of the wagon. The door opened only as much as a hand and a half. "Town business," Barrett announced to the crack in the wind and any destiny within hearing. "Open up." "No," Sorrel said. The word felt like it had been waiting in her mouth for a season. "If you aim to condemn my shelter while there's still dust hanging in the street, you can do it from the stoop." "Your shelter?" Prouse made the phrase sound like a misdemeanor. "Miss Greer, as I've said on more than one occasion, the livery is the town's, though we've been generous letting you sleep in that broom closet. I work here. I keep your horses on their legs and your buggies on their wheels. The town owns walls. I kept them from joining the sky. By allowing an itinerant to set fires on town property," Barrett cut in, pointer finger already in accusation. "I saw the stove sparking. Reckless endangerment. We'll need to take him in for questioning." He made the word question sound like a cudgel. Ivor didn't stand to that. He didn't even straighten. He sat where he was, close enough to Sorrel that his shadow wrapped the edge of the blanket, and looked at Barrett like a man looking at rain. An inconvenience with no moral authority. "Stove would have set sparks with a dead man tending it. Wind did the rest. Your bullet helped." He said it without heat. Sorrel watched Barrett's face and saw the moment the memory stabbed through his own smokescreen. The deputy's cheeks went flat with the effort of deciding he hadn't heard. "Clag," Roland Tauk said, not loud, but in the voice of a man used to telling forges what to do. "You plan on stepping into that room and telling a woman still bleeding to get out of it?" Barrett didn't answer the blacksmith. He addressed the safer enemy, Ivor. "Name?" "Ivor Vale." "Where from?" "Wherever the fire went last." Barrett wrote the not answer in the air with his mouth and pretended his pencil had done the same. "We got vagrancy ordinances. We got decency ordinances. We got—" "Not today you don't," Miss Dunn said crisply from the road. She had collected children into the aura of her competence, and they orbited her as small planets do a summer moon. "Today we have triage and towels and neighbors." She looked deliberately at the blacksmith, then at the mercantile man. "And boards and nails. Tomorrow you can preen your ordinances until they shine." Prouse bristled. Barrett bristled harder. Roland didn't bristle at all. He just set his hand against the door as if to feel the hinge's opinion. "It'll hold for today. We can sister a brace by afternoon if I can find a saw that didn't learn to fly." "Got one," Ivor said. He nudged his pack with his foot. "Two, if you count the rusted cousin that only bites when you sing to it." Prouse peered through the door's small permission and squinted at Ivor like a man considering a new kind of metal. "You know your way around temper?" "Fire taught me most of it. Iron taught me the rest." Prouse huffed. "We'll not be employing transients at town expense." Sorrel felt heat that wasn't the brick crawl up her neck. "You'll be employing whoever keeps your roof out of your soup." She shifted the infant higher against her chest. The baby rooted with the blind conviction of nature and found what it wanted. A tiny mouth latched, Sorrel's breath hitched at the sharp pull, and then steadied into something almost like relief. The room changed around that fact, quieted sharp, as if acknowledging a treaty older than law. Prouse looked away as if decency was something to be embarrassed about. Barrett's mouth flattened into a new kind of mean. He put his hand out. "That child needs to be seen by Doc, and we put mothers in the cellar at the school in weather like this, new mothers most of all." He found ground that could pass for concern and stood on it as if he owned it. "Regulations. We'll go when the door stops thinking it's a kite. Doc Green's got half the town lying on his floor. He'll come when he can." "I'll fetch him," Miss Dunn said, already moving. "Roland, get your wagon. Irv, find that stack of shingles you've never sold and pretend you always meant to. Barrett planted his boots and folded his arms. Not finished here. You will be if you keep standing in a doorway when there's lifting to do.
For an hour that felt like the first honest hour in a year, they lifted. Ivor and Roland sistered a brace beneath the sullen rafter while the wind reconsidered its career. Barrett fetched nails because no one told him not to quickly enough. Proust discovered that shingles had their uses and told anyone within earshot that he'd always said so. Children carried small wood as if it were treasure and reported back with faces bright and grave that made grief both harder and easier to stand. Miss Dunn arrived with Doc Green's bag and Doc's instructions written in her exacting hand. The baby slept after eating, belly round as a carpenter's thumb. Sorrel wrapped the cord stump as Doc would have, nodded her own work with a tidy pride her mother would have approved. She sipped water that tasted faintly of iron and exactly of mercy. The brick leaked warmth into her bones like an apology delivered by the right mouth at the right time. "You'll have milk enough?" Ivor asked, not coy and not bold. He wasn't looking at her when he asked. He was watching the way Roland's wedge bit into a stubborn seam. "If that's the first thing I fail at, it'll be a miracle," she said. "I've failed at quieter tasks." He accepted that without argument. "If you need broth, I've got bones that still remember cow in the pack." Who keeps bones in his pack? A man who's learned soup is the only apology Winter accepts. She almost smiled. "You talk like your pockets are full of proverbs." "They're full of matches, mostly," he said. "The rest is ash and hope." By late afternoon, light had the decency to act like light again. The green had leached out of the sky, leaving a tired blue stitched with brown along the horizon where the funnel had dragged its skirts. Larkridge counted itself. Some houses stood and blinked. Some sat down hard and didn't get up. The church steeple had chosen to lie down in the road and look at the world sideways, and did so with more dignity than most men achieved in their lives. Doc Green arrived with the exact steps of a man who had 10 places to be and decided to be good at all of them. He knelt by Sorrel, washed his hands in the basin, and did the work that makes a midwife of science. Checked the bleeding, frowned properly at the bruising, nodded at the cord, and made a noise at Ivor's arm that suggested men were idiots about their own skin. "Should stitch that. Won't, but should." "Won't," Ivor confirmed, as if they were playing cards and had discovered the same number on 2 different decks. Doc peered at the newborn. He said, "Well now," in a voice that would have soothed a river into not flooding. He listened to the chest with his ear because his listening instrument had gone to visit a different patient by mistake and hadn't returned. "Strong," he pronounced, to the child and to the town and possibly to the sun. "Keep her warm and keep yourself warm. Eat, sleep when she sleeps, and try to remember that asking for help isn't a crime here, even when Clag Barrett says it is." He raised his voice without turning his head. "Clag, if you point that jaw at me, I'll set it myself, and you won't like where it lands." Barrett made a show of being useful by handing Doc the wrong bag, and was thanked in a way that made it clear he'd helped exactly as much as he'd been allowed. He waited until Doc moved to the blacksmith's wagon, then took a folded paper from inside his coat and smoothed it on the wagon's splintered flank like a man about to perform surgery on the truth. "Resolution of the town board," he announced, and found his base again now that the sky wasn't in competition. "The livery at 3 Main is condemned on account of a compromised north wall and fire hazard. Residents to vacate immediately. Town will remove goods and livestock to public lot for inventory pending sale to cover repairs."
Sorrel felt the floor rock under her in a way that had nothing to do with weather. "You waited," she said, not a question. "You waited until a storm could do your work for you, and then you write a thieving letter to make it legal?" Her mother's voice rose up out of the old trunk in her memory. "Don't accuse a man of theft if you can accuse him of cowardice. It grinds longer." Barrett lifted his chin. "Board's duty is to keep public property safe from misuse. You were told to shelter in the schoolhouse. You chose to stay. That makes any damage your fault." "Fault?" Roland barked. "She kept 6 of our horses from turning into street meat, and she brought a new Lark Ridge soul squalling into a world that had just tried to peel our roofs back. If you wrote that paper, Clag, you wrote it in the dry with your boots up and your pen warm." Prouse discovered that shingles had their uses and told anyone within earshot that he'd always said so. Prouse found a new pinchedness. "Repairs aren't free. We'll auction off what must be auctioned." "What must be auctioned?" Miss Dunn repeated, as if sampling a word she might throw at a different meal later. "You mean the tools she uses to feed herself. You mean the horse she rides to fetch the midwife you never remember to pay. You mean the blankets everyone borrows and never brings back." "Law is law," Prouse said, encouraged by the sound of his own voice. "Plenty of honest folk abide by it." "Plenty of honest folk don't write it," Doc Green observed without heat. He tied off the last stitch on Roland's apprentice's scalp, bit the thread, and stood. He had blood on his cuff and no time to mind it. "Clag, you try to take that baby out from under her, you'll need a new hand. Irv, you try to take her livelihood out from under her, you'll need a new store. And I am very tired." Barrett shifted. Some men step back when the ground they pick turns to water. Some dig their heels in. Clag Barrett had never met a hole he didn't want to be deeper. He lifted the paper like a shield. Immediate. Ivor rose then, unfolded really, from the floor where he'd been 2 quiet inches of steadiness. He wasn't a big man in the way some men are big. He took up space by convincing gravity he had a better offer. He stepped to the stove, fetched the clay pot, and set it on the table between Barrett's paper and Sorrel's bed. Untied the rope and took off the lid. Heat rose, clean and reliable, with the smell of yesterday's work turning into tomorrow's promise. "What's that?" Barrett said, sneer rickety. "Memory," Ivor said. "What keeps a town alive when the maps forget it. You want to condemn the roof? Fine, but you don't blow this out. People will be cold tonight. People will boil water they shouldn't drink unless they make it talk. People will not die of heartbreak if they can put their hands out and remember they are animals that learned fire." He looked at Sorrel then, not a plea, but an answer. "We build a hearth outside. I'll bank it against the wind with bricks. I'll keep it hot until the last roof is patched. Folks come. They bring their pans. They get a turn. He doesn't have to like it." He didn't bother to nod at Barrett. "It's not his." "You can't set an open fire in the street," Prouse said, the words popping like corn. "Ordnance." Miss Dunn clapped her chalk-dusted hands once, lightly. "Suggest a place, Irv. Before he suggests one you'll like less." Roland pointed with his chin. "Blacksmith yard is shielded. Stone on 3 sides. We got the well." "Town property," Barrett tried again, thread fraying. "And town need," Doc Green said, "which outranks you by any law I ever studied." He wiped his hands on his coat because there wasn't time to be precious. He looked at Sorrel. "Can you be moved to the smithy yard on a litter? It's 20 steps." The thought of moving made her bones consider mutiny. The thought of lying here while men argued about the roof over her child, something brighter set its feet. "I can be stood," she said.
You'll swear at me for it, but I can be stood." She gathered the blanket around her and looked foolishly, greedily for her boots, as if their presence would make walking less of a joke. Ivor had already set them near her feet. Of course he had. Of course he'd known what her eyes would ask. "Wait," Barrett said. He hadn't prepared for a procession. He had prepared for a siege. He held up the paper as if light would shine through it and show everyone the rightness of its ink. "You can't—" Thunder. The ordinary kind and the worst kind rolled. The sky had new ideas. Along the eastern edge of town, a curtain of rain had grown a spine. The air went mean again, not like it had earlier, more like a whip. Roland lifted his head the way a stallion does when another stallion enters the field. "We've got another." Sorrel's body, treacherous and loyal both, chose that exact moment to remember it had been through war. A wash of weakness rolled up from her feet and emptied her hands. Dizziness brought stars indoors. The baby sensed the change, snuffled, complained, and relapsed.
The blacksmith took one look at the sky and made the sort of decision a town remembers. He shouldered the door, shoved, and the bracing bin slid enough to give a man room and a litter's width. Ivor and Roland lifted Sorrel together. She bit her lip hard enough to feel future scabs and didn't apologize to anyone for the tears that found their own work. The child did not stop eating, which struck Sorrel as both obscene and absolutely correct. Outside, the yard had become a study in willing. Men willed boards to be heavier and thus less likely to take flight. Women willed blankets to be roofs and found they mostly could. Children willed themselves small enough to survive and succeeded in ways that broke hearts. The blacksmith's yard, stone-shouldered and stubborn, took the procession in with a generosity only large, useful places have. Ivor set the clay pot on a flat of stone and pulled bricks around it like a pastor making a circle for prayer. He fed it with a kiss of splinters, coaxed it into a steady voice, banked it against the wind with a suet of ash. He moved as if he had done this in 100 towns whose names were now the names of winter, and as if this might be the last town he wanted to teach. He built not a bonfire, no flare, no show, but a low, convincing heat that understood soup and bandages and the courage of hands. People gathered. Prouse gathered last and looked as if he wanted to charge admission. Miss Dunn put the kettle on with the air of a woman placing a crown. Doc Green used the first boil to clean a cut on a boy's palm that would have festered into a story. Roland hauled the worst of the new braces into shape and hammered them to the beat of a heart refusing to fail. Barrett hovered at the edge of it all, paper wilting in his hand, Badge looking for an excuse it hadn't earned. He watched Ivor make a hearth out of a street, watched Sorrel sit with her back against a block of iron and her baby under her chin and the look on her face of a woman who had negotiated with storm and won. Something mean and something frightened fought in him, and neither won fast enough to stop the next bad idea. He called 3 men from the knot of onlookers, the sort who owed favors and hadn't yet found a way to repay them with decency. We seized the livery tack and the mare as collateral pending board decision. We removed the vagrant to the jail. "You try to take Nettle," Sorrel said, without raising her voice, "and you'll lose more than your hat." The 3 men shifted, not wanting to be the first fool through the door of a woman's promise. Barrett filled the absence with his chest. By authority vested. Authority had a different idea. A section of the church roof, delayed in its collapse by stubbornness and luck, chose that moment to understand gravity again. It tore loose with the slow, terrible dignity of old things giving in, and tumbled toward the street where 3 children stood gaping at the honest physics of disaster. There are men who think first and move later, and there are men whose bodies are argument enough. Ivor went like a thrown truth. He didn't sprint so much as he erased the space between himself and the falling slate with a refusal. He scooped the nearest child under an arm and shoved the other 2 with a shove that knew exactly how hard to be. The roof came down where 3 small futures had been learning how to count. The slate exploded on the edge of Roland's anvil with a clang that sounded like history correcting itself. The children screamed the way puppets would if someone remembered to give them lungs. Then they screamed like children and threw themselves under Miss Dunn's skirts, which is how salvation traditionally concludes in Larkridge. Ivor stood with dust in his hair and a grin that had done hard time in a scar. Anvils, he said, to no one in particular, as if they'd come into fashion. Something tender and savage wove together in Sorrel's chest. It sounded like a vow and tasted like iron. She saw Barrett see it and take a step back as if vows could bite. The eastern sky came apart in sheets. The second funnel thickened, ugly as a grudge, and set its mouth down on a strip of prairie that never once asked for such attention. It chewed toward the town as if offended by the smell of defiance. A third rope dangled from its skirt like an afterthought that might decide to be something else if given half a chance. "Down," Miss Dunn called. Not shrill, not soft. "Cellars if you've got them. Walls if you don't. Bring water, bring blankets, bring your neighbors." She pointed at boys old enough to be stupid and made them smarter by assigning them tasks. She pointed at Barrett and made him useful by sheer force of grammar. "Clag, you take the west wall and make sure no one's alone. Irv, your shingles. Roland." "I know," Roland said, and already knew the thing she meant he would know. Ivor turned to Sorrel with the honesty of a man who had used up his lie for the day. "We can get you to the smithy cellar. It's dry, it holds." "Not yet," she said, astonishing herself with the steadiness in it. She looked at the low fire he'd banked, the small, disciplined certainty of it, and at the clay pot that had crossed miles like a prayer nobody wanted credit for. She looked at Nettle's ears slanted toward her from the livery yard, and at Miss Dunn's jaw, and at Roland's shoulders, and, against every smart instruction she'd ever given herself about men, she looked at Ivor's hands. "If that goes out," she said, and nodded at the hearth, "we lose something I don't know the name of. I won't let it." "I believe you," she said. "That's the part that scares me most." The wind hit them sideways. The banked embers hunkered, ash lifted and swirled like gypsy skirts. The clay pot hopped one tick to the left as if to get a better look at the horizon. Sparks fled, went 2 feet, changed their minds, returned to the circle like disciplined children coming back to apology. Barrett tried one last time to be the man the paper thought he was. He strode forward and stomped his heel toward the edge of the hearth. "Town says no open fires, and—" "I wouldn't," Ivor said, without raising his voice or his head. "She'll bite you." "She?" Barrett laughed and made it a nasty joke. He didn't finish the cheap joke. The wind pushed him and the joke slipped out of his pocket and rolled under a wagon wheel. He reached with his boot to shove the brick back toward the glowing center and caught the edge of a coal with his heel. It leapt, because living things do when threatened, and landed in a seam of straw at the base of the anvil block. The straw sighed, and then remembered what it always wanted to be. Flame crawled up as quick and low as a fox finding its shape in brush. Ivor moved as if he had done this in 100 towns, whose names were now the names of winter, and as if this might be the last town he wanted to teach. He built not a bonfire, no flare, no show, but a low, convincing heat that understood soup and bandages and the courage of hands. "Water," Miss Dunn called, and 3 boys brought a bucket that solished conviction but not enough technique. Roland swore. Ivor swore without wasting the air. Barrett swore using words he had no right to. Sorrel didn't swear. She set the baby into Miss Dunn's arms without ceremony and without permission, because Miss Dunn had arms for it and always had arms for it, even when the town had been less decent than today. The blanket fell away from her shoulder in a useless flower. She went to her knees in the straw and clapped her hands over the nearest fox before it could tell its friends what freedom tasted like. Pain sang. Not the clean pain from earlier. Forge work, accomplishing something. This was the mean, quick bite of a thing that knew it could win if she let it. The tender meat of her palm answered with blister and message. She didn't move. She smothered the flame as if it were a lie, and she a woman tired of being lied to. "Don't," Ivor said, his voice landing in her ear like an order he didn't want to give. He was already bringing the shovel up under the second fox. He banged it down, and the spark caught the metal and skated, looking for more straw to teach. The The third fox found a ribbon of hay that led toward the stacked kindling. Sorrel saw the path the way a horse sees a gate and knows whether it will hold. She crawled, ignoring the way her insides argued. She slapped the second coal with the flat of her hand, hissed between her teeth, and dared her body to complain later when there was still a later to spend. The coal got flatter, red through the thin skin of ash like a tongue sticking out at a fool. She trapped it with her palm and felt the old woman in Ivor's story laugh in her bones. The third spark leapt the seam and raced for the kindling. Miss Dunn's bucket came down like lousy rain and missed what it should have married. Barrett lunged and stomped with his heel and ground the flame into sawdust that remembered it was a tree too late. Roland shoved his apron down and made a suffocation of cowhide that you could have called grace if you felt generous. The second coal wriggled under Sorrel's hand like something made of decisions. The first trembled and then went out, an obedient child. The third tried one last trick and found Ivor's shovel stubborn and cold. "Leave it," someone shouted, afraid for Sorrel's skin more than for the town. She didn't. She pressed down until the coal made its case to her nerves and her nerves conceded, and then she closed both hands around it, cupping the small red like a stolen jewel, and lifted. Heat wrote its language into her palms. The wind took a breath big enough to rearrange counties. The baby howled from Miss Dunn's chest like a bell that remembered purpose. Ivor's eyes found Sorrel's, and something in them changed shape like iron under a hammer, went from useful to tool to vow. She walked the 4 steps to the brick circle like a woman walking down an aisle in a church with no roof, and set the coal back into the nest Ivor had made for what kept them all from going animal, and then ghost. It brightened like pride does when it's asked to build something instead of ruin it. She swayed. The world grayed at the edges as if charcoal had been rubbed there on purpose. Ivor's hands were under her elbows before her knees remembered they were negotiable.
Waited. Wind slipped a thin blade under the lip of morning and tested it. Sorrel stood with the clay pot's warm belly against her hip, feeling its steady hum travel into bone, the same way the newborn's breath nested against her ribs and taught them a smaller rhythm to keep. The yard had the restless quiet of faces washed after a funeral, the kind that doesn't mean the grief is gone, only that it has decided to ride in the back for a few miles. She watched the marshal's wagon turn down the cottonwood cut, watched the back of Ivor's hat bob once, twice, then disappear behind scrub. The wheel ruts kept their mouths shut. Barrett sat stiff on the bench like a man performing virtue, shoulders squared against a wind that might have been memory. When they vanished, the yard felt too large for its own boots. "Sit," Miss Dunn ordered, not unkindly, and the order was a blanket. Sorrel obeyed, because she had learned, in a span that felt like a lifetime and had taken only a night, that some obedience was a kind of mercy. She sat on the cot Roland had set near the low hearth. Heat rolled into her like a tide that remembered where the shore was. The baby finished making the small complaint that meant more milk and less discussion, then latched with a sigh that unlaced something in Sorrel she hadn't known was tied. The blister along her palm had filled like a stubborn cloud. Doc's salve shone where it couldn't yet help, and she kept her hand as still as a story told the right first time. Nettle's ears showed in the gap of the livery door, precise triangles against a strip of surviving shade. The mare had forgiven the weather and kept the score. The foal, already long-legged and ridiculous, slept on its sternum, neck crooked the way babies do when they don't yet understand vertebrae. Moss, Old Testament prophet with hay in his beard,
breathed loud as a bellows, and started from every shadow like a man who expects debt collectors. The Cedar Hollow men remained where they'd planted themselves, not because they belonged, but because leaving would have required a kind of humility that would have wrinkled their coats. Their pinless leader kept adjusting his tie, as if decency could be accomplished by the millimeter. Prouse lingered near them, Ledger held like a shield he hoped could stop bullets shot by eyes. He looked smaller without the store's door behind him. Doc Green was a hinge, swinging where he was needed. He stitched a woman's forehead with thread meant for cuffs and told a boy that yes, the scar would look like a crescent moon, and no, he did not get to keep the needle. Roland spoke to iron with the confidence of a man who had never been betrayed by it, and told Barrett, when Barrett drifted near like a fly who craved authority, which hooks to lift and when. Barrett had the look of a man told to stand in the corner by a conscience that might finally be sharpening. He kept one eye on the road and one on the pot, as if either might leap. His badge was newly polished and looked guilty about it. Sorrel had nowhere to put the feeling that rose in her. It wasn't grief for what had gone. Not exactly. Not grief for Ivor. Not exactly. It was the sensation of a door swinging open inside her chest, wider than breath, and hung on hinges that had been oiled by fear. Past the door was not relief. Not yet. Past the door was a road she recognized, the one toward trouble, the one that asks if you are quiet or if you are the sort to answer when called. "Eat," Miss Dunn said again, and foisted a mug at her. The broth was thin and perfect. Sorrel drank and felt it argue on her tongue and agree in her belly. "You're no good to anyone if you fall over." "Not intending to," Sorrel muttered, which wasn't the same as a plan. "Intentions are quilts," Miss Dunn said briskly, "useful only if you keep them mended." She glanced toward the Cedar Hollow men and smiled in a way that bared no teeth. "Sleep when she does," she added, and nodded at the baby. "We'll keep the fire and the fools from quarreling too loudly." Sorrel pursed her mouth because the idea of sleep felt like strangers at her table, possibly generous, possibly thieves. But the baby's eyes had softened to slits, the warmth held like grammar. Doc's hand landing light on her wrist for a count that felt less like measuring and more like blessing, made an argument she was willing to believe. She leaned her head back against the cot's rolled canvas and let the world unspool to a thinner thread. Her mind wouldn't grant her sleep without one last look at the door in her chest. Behind it was Reeves, grinning, fool boy, wedding ribbon in his pocket like a dare. Behind that, a kiln fallen in on itself and an ember carried like a secret. Behind that, the sound a bullet makes in muscle, and the way law says nothing for a long, long time after it has said all it thinks it needs to. She stood there, asleep and not, until the door itself took pity and closed from the other side. She woke to hands not touching her, men's voices without their usual chest in them, a whisper that had not learned manners. The baby slept heavy against her, mouth open, fists fisted like every fight had already been won. The hearth purred like a cat that had decided to adopt the town. "Company men," Roland was saying, jaw turned to grindstone. "They don't come for what they say they come for. They come to make a point." "They won't make it here," Miss Dunn answered. "Not while their arithmetic depends on me forgetting how to count." Barrett cleared his throat in that officious way that meant he was about to audition for a new version of himself. He announced that Dawn had arrived and departed without asking him, which meant that the prisoner was on county soil by now, which meant this, he gestured at the iron-chained clay pot like a man gesturing at a goat tied to a tree, was no longer a factor. "It's exactly the factor," Doc Green said, not bothering to put down the bandage he was winding. "If you had eyes instead of a badge today, Clegg, you'd see that." Barrett's face did something complicated that might have been shame trying out his features and not finding purchase. He opened his mouth to argue and closed it because Miss Dunn had stepped one precise inch closer, and the yard held its breath to see if he could learn. Prowse took half a step toward Sorrel in the cot. Ledger clutched like a child who'd found an argument and was eager to bring it to show and tell. "Miss Greer," he began, voice butter-soft and dull as an old knife, "we're not without sympathy. These circumstances—" He gestured at the air as if circumstances were something he could swat away with his pen. "But the town can't carry all of this alone. We need to raise what we can, liquidate as necessary, the mare, the tack, the extra—" He flinched when Miss Dunn's cough sounded like sharpening. "The surplus. Temporary measures." Sorrel swung her legs off the cot with more steadiness than the world had any right to expect. She folded the blanket back with care that Prowse's eyebrows climbed as if care itself was an accusation. "You don't have the word surplus here," she said. "Not today. You have tools and the people who know how to use them. You sell either, you'll need to sell the other, and then you'll be left with numbers that won't plow, won't nurse, won't bend iron." Prowse's mouth did a fish flicker. "The board is 3 men in a room with air that smells like ink," Miss Dunn finished, sweetly savage. "We are the air out here. Breathe with us or choke on your own paper." The Cedar Hollow men conferred among their coats. Their foreman, Lightpin, almost tilted his head to listen with his eyes. "We admire community," he said, tasting the word as if he might order it off a menu. "We are community elsewhere, but community is not opposed to progress." He shifted his gaze to Sorrel, and the look was almost kind, and thus more dangerous. "You have a child. This—"
"Greer," Sorrel said, "we call each other by our names here. Miss Greer," he corrected, "will accept placement in our facility up north. Respectable, safe, supervised." He let the word hang where Prowse could smell it. "And your baby will not grow up with the wrong ideas." "If I wanted the wrong ideas, I'd have married a man with a clean hat." Roland barked a laugh that sounded like a sledge at first strike. The children who'd been pretending not to watch giggled and then pretended not to. Miss Dunn didn't smile because she was too busy owning the room. Kellen Reed's smile went inside out. "I can be gentler than the law," he said. "Don't make me prove I can be harder." Doc Green stepped and the entire yard leaned with him. "You attempt to remove a mother and child under my care," he said. "You'll learn new anatomy from the inside with a dull spoon." Reed flicked his eyes over Doc's coat, which had more blood on it than most men managed to see in a year, and decided he didn't enjoy where that sentence might lead. He nodded toward the 2 riders behind him. They slipped down from their horses with boneless efficiency and started toward the livery with the sort of step that had practiced being unremarkable until it got tired and decided to be a strut. Roland didn't lift his hammer.
He simply stood in the doorway to the livery like a door that had grown a face and a vow. "You touch those animals," he said, "I'll teach you the difference between a bruise and a lesson." "Clegg," Kellen Reed said pleasantly, "your town officer." Barrett swallowed and became a sound men made when they are learning the names of their bones. He looked at Prowse. Prowse looked at his ledger. He looked at Miss Dunn. Miss Dunn looked at him like he could become human if he hurried. He looked at Sorrel, who didn't blink, and Roland, who also didn't blink, because men who hit iron for a living can hold their eyes open longer than cowards. Barrett took a step that made no sound because it was the sort of step that wished it were behind a desk. "We're done stepping," Miss Dunn announced. "We are now fixing." "What are you fixing?" Reed asked. "The part of this town that thinks money is apparent," Miss Dunn said. Reed's eyes cooled. He put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled. From the alley to the east, 3 more men appeared, not on horses, on foot, cheeks like knives. From behind the church's humbled bell, a 4th stepped into his shadow. Their coats swelled oddly at the hip, where trouble sleeps. Reed's voice softened like a handkerchief. "Last chance," he said. "No," Sorrel said. Her voice did not break and did not ask permission. "First." She stood. She was not fast. She was done being fast until her bones forgave her. She lifted the clay pot, chain clinking where Roland had made iron a gentleman, and set it on the ground between them, within the ring of bricks that knew their jobs. She lifted the lid. Heat rose like a prayer that had discovered it was a promise. She did not move her burned hand. She used the good one and let the blistered palm rest where it needed to. She reached with the poker and drew a thin sliver of ember to the lip. She blowed on it once, not hard, not dramatic, just enough to give it her name. "You put a boot in this?" she said to Reed, to Prowse, to the Cedar Hollow men whose hats were new and souls untried, to Barrett, whose badge had grown heavy. "You put a boot in this? You put a boot in the only thing that's made us human today. And I will name you to your faces and to your children's faces and to anyone who asks me for the rest of my life. I will call you by your names in my mouth until the day you die. Do you understand me?" It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Some words are iron filings on the tongue. They cut on their own. Kellen Reed's jaw flinched. The men behind him did math they hadn't expected to have to do. Prowse tried to remember what it felt like to be in a room where he was not the tallest idea. "Fine," he said after a breath that tried to be a sigh and failed. "No fire, for now. We'll begin with assets." He tilted his head at the 2 nearest, men with eyes like receipts. "Remove the mare, remove the tack, document as we go. If anyone interferes, I'll ask the deputy to deputize the rest of your town, and we'll have a merry parade." Roland shifted his weight and became a piece of architecture. Miss Dunn made a list of names that would be sorry. Barrett tried on a backbone in private. Sorrel didn't think. Thinking is too slow when history reaches for your throat. She handed the baby to Miss Dunn and did it with trust that tasted like lightning. She crossed the yard without running and found something she knew, the livery doorway. It had held against wind and argument. It would hold again. She put her body in it. "You love that animal?" Kellen Reed asked lazily. "Enough to get yourself hurt in front of your child?" "I love what's mine because I make it so. And if I must demonstrate that in front of her, good, I'll save a lecture later." Reed nodded to one of his men. The man stepped with the sort of economy that fit him like a bruise. He reached shoulder-high toward Sorrel's sternum with 2 fingers, the way men do when they mean to move a woman like she were a curtain. Sorrel didn't swat his hand away. She caught his wrist. Her burned palm screamed its alphabet. She let it. She twisted, not hard, not generous. The man dropped and discovered his own breath had opinions. Roland raised one eyebrow like a teacher who had not assigned that particular homework, but found himself entertained. "Enough," Reed said, and the silk went out of his voice. Clag. Don't, Doc Green warned. Let the woman stand where she wants to stand. The world has stood on her all night. Callan Reed's jaw made a decision his mouth would regret later. Fine, he said. We'll begin elsewhere. You can't be everywhere. He pointed at the stable wall where the loft had burned low and honest after trying not to. Rope that corner. Pull. If the wall drops, the stock will stampede to the lot. We'll catch them there. No, Sorrel said, and that word was not an argument, it was a gate. She reached for the halter hanging on the peg, slipped it over Nettle's head with the sort of intimacy only earned, and stepped into the stall. The mare breathed her in and let her hand live on her cheek. She spoke into the velvet there, the language all animals believe before they know better. Easy, my girl, easy. You owe no one your fear. She glanced over the door and found Roland's eyes. Open, she said. He opened. Sorrel led Nettle into the aisle with a steadiness she did not bargain for. The foal scrambled and then found the brain God had put in its legs for moments like this. Moss huffed disapproval at all of them, and then, with the immoral cowardice of the old, decided to follow any hay that would have him. Huckle, closet genius masquerading as disaster, found his feet and did as he was told. They came out into the yard like truth, unpretty, unashamed, necessary. Sorrel put Nettle's nose briefly to the clay pot, so the mare could remember what heat meant today. The foal tried to suckle the anvil and learned disappointment. Reed's men didn't step back because they were brave. They stepped back because they were cowards who enjoyed living.
Lot, Reed said, and pointed past the smithy toward the public pen where the town kept its fares honest. We'll sort there. We'll sort here, Sorrel said, with eyes that know what they're counting. It might have been a stalemate if the world were only a catalog of hat brims. It wasn't. The rider from the ridge, tidy hat, tidy plan, paper tucked where decent men keep pictures, had chosen that moment to arrive in the alley behind the schoolhouse, 2 men with him and a sack between them that had never been used for flour. They moved like men who had practiced in empty towns. They had a list. Sorrel's name was not on the first page, only the second. But then the wind took pity on no one and curved their route to the smithy by a path the town itself had made, 2 winters of footsteps across the same scar, a shortcut that had elected itself. Morning, the tidy hat said when he appeared at the yard's lip, and that word almost sounded like a threat, only because of the men who carried it. His eyes ticked over Callan Reed's men and dismissed them for not having the proper invoice attached. He looked at Barrett and saw a uniform an inch deep. He looked at Miss Dunn and looked away because grammar frightened him. He found Sorrel and, in the space of one breath, he counted her blister, her stance, the baby in Miss Dunn's arm, and the pot at her feet. He nodded as if a plan had found a shape it liked. By order of Cedar Hollow and its associates, he said, "We're taking the woman in." Inquiry. "No," Barrett said. He said it softly, like a man talking to a horse he hoped not to spook. "Marshals on the county line," Tidy Hat said, and pulled a paper from his coat with a flourish of a gambler's whose deck no one had searched. "Private contract supersedes in this case." He waved it as if ink itself could change the weather. Signatories. He read names like they were spells. Irv Prouse, Boardman Jacob Withers, Boardman Emery Carr, Deputy Clag Barrett. Barrett flinched. "I didn't." "It says you did," Tidy Hat said, which in certain rooms is all that's required to make a thing true. Prowse paled the way flour does right before it falls in the bowl. There was a draft. I didn't approve the—" "Then don't," Miss Dunn said. "Now." Prowse opened his mouth, closed it, and discovered to his surprise that he still had hands. He dipped the paper, tore it in half, then in half again. It felt less like bravery than a man finally disagreeing with his own reflection. The Tidy Hat laughed, unkindly. "Paper breeds quicker than rabbits," he said. He lifted 2 more sheets from another pocket. "You can ruin one letter. There's a dozen unborn in a desk somewhere." "You take 1 more step toward her," Roland said. "Your bones will make a music I don't care for." 2 men moved anyway. They stepped around the anvil and put their hands out as if to offer help to a woman who had not asked. Miss Dunn shifted the baby to one hip and with the other hand lifted a ladle that had not been intimidated by soup all day.
She stood between them and discovered again her talent for being a wall. Sorrel did not retreat. She moved sideways, a learned thing, from years of letting a nervous horse pretend it had invented her idea. She put nettle between herself and the tidy hat. The mare laid her ears back in the universal language of, "You'll be sorry." "Don't make this ugly," Tidy Hat said. "It's already is," Sorrel answered. He nodded to his men. They came in a rush that thought it was a plan. Roland's allet met a wrist. Miss Dunn's ladle met a nose and discovered to nobody's surprise that noses bleed well enough without invitations. Barrett reached for his gun and found his hand catching Miss Dunn's glare instead, and redirected with a kind of shameful grace to grip a shoulder and swing it away from Sorrel. Prouse, a minor miracle, tripped a man with ledger accuracy. Kellen Reed stood by and watched, one corner of his mouth wrinkled as if the mess displeased him aesthetically, but not morally. He held up a restraining hand toward his own men, because a fight between contractors saves a company money, and he planned to enjoy the savings. Sorrel had no fist to spare and no interest in starting a collection. She had a halter lead and the patience to use it. She flicked the rope, quick and precise, into a loop that found a man's ankle and taught him geometry. He fell with the astonishment men reserve for gravity's stubbornness. He stepped aside when he thrashed, did not bother to kick him, saved the anger for something that had earned it. "Enough," Tidy Hat snapped, and pulled from his coat the only argument some men believe in, a small pistol that imagined itself bigger. He aimed, not at Sorrel, he wasn't a fool, and not at Roland, he wasn't suicidal, but at the clay pot. "This is where he lives. This is what he taught you. Take it away and the myth will starve." Sorrel's breath sawed. The blister found a new octave. The baby in Miss Dunn's arm squeaked a small horn calling a small cavalry. "Don't," Sorrel said. "Move," Tidy Hat said, and cocked the hammer with the smug little click that makes decent men consider unlearning decency. Barrett moved first, not fast, not elegant, but honest. He stepped between Tidy Hat and the pot, hands open, badge visible, and at last for the right reason. "Enough," he said. "You shoot a woman's hearth in front of her, you'll need more paperwork than you've got pockets." Tidy Hat laughed and sighted past him. The barrel flicked left, a hair, a thought, and pointed at the baby. Sorrel didn't think. Her body moved in the old way, toward, not away. She crossed the yard in the length of a heartbeat she didn't have to spare. Palm out, blister open, and gripped the muzzle. Heat bit sting hard at the oil-slick steel. Her skin sang with it. She shoved, down and away, felt the gun's bark at close range tear a bite out of the dirt where the pot's shadow leaned. The world jumped, cursed, then chose a different key. Roland's mallet rose. Barrett's fist, long unused, longer resented, found the Tidy Hat's jaw with a dull sound and a satisfaction that startled him into 3 new versions of himself. Miss Dunn's ladle described a high, perfect arc and tapped the second man on the temple with all the calm of punctuation. Prouse threw his ledger, a sin he would confess to his shelves later, and struck a third across the ear so soundly he remembered arithmetic backwards. Kellen Reed held up both hands. "Enough," he said. For the first time his voice meant it. "We're not dying over a pot." "No," Sorrel said, eyes wild and clear. "You're not living without it either." The yard steadied, the Tidy Hat bleeding from his lip and discovering his pistol had learned to fly, cursed in a curious, educated way. He backed off, hands at his sides, calculating. He wasn't counting humans, he was counting outcomes. He had discovered he did not care for either available. He turned to Kellen Reed and found no immediate contract. He turned to Barrett and found, to his surprise, a man. He turned to Sorrel and found a wall of heat and was too wise to lean on it again. "We're done," he said, lying. He signaled to his men. They retreated without showing their backs, the way water recedes from a rock it can't shape. "For now." He flicked a look at Kellen Reed that in another grammar said, "Not your town, not your myth, our ledger." When they were gone, down the alley, into their saddles, into the next chapter he intended to write elsewhere, Kellen Reed exhaled and looked 10 years more human. He scrubbed a palm down his face like a man washing a bad dream. "You're making friends," he told Sorrel.
He nodded, a concession he would never put in stone. He tipped his hat to Miss Dunn and to Doc Green in what might pass, if you squinted, for respect, then to Roland in a shape that meant he knew where his teeth would trouble him tomorrow.
He looked once more at the pot, as if to memorize its diameter for a report he wouldn't write. "We'll talk again," he told Prouse, whose ledger lay in the dust like a lost child. "Preferably when your teacher isn't on the board." He left, his men with him, the yard expanding behind them like a lung relieved of corset. The sudden quiet smelled of singed hair and soup, and a new thing Sorrel wasn't ready to name. She could feel the long emptiness after adrenaline, the tired that goes all the way to the nails and asks whether there's any you left inside the costume. The baby answered by being heavier in Miss Dunn's arms, and then wailing with the misfortune of a body inconvenienced by an empty stomach, exactly when a heart wanted to talk. "Feed," Miss Dunn said, and handed the small, insistent creature back. "Talk later. Talk sours if you serve it in the wrong order." Sorrel settled. The baby latched. The world obtained edges again. Barrett stood with his hands hanging like dogs not sure where to lie down. He looked at Sorrel as if she had just undone something tight around his throat. He looked at the pot as if it had manners he would like to learn. He looked at his own knuckles with the baffled awe of a man who had just used them decently. He began. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an excuse. It was the first letter of a language he had not been taught. He looked at Doc Green because Doc's face had always known grammar. "I'll ride after the marshal. Tell him about the men from the ridge." Doc Green nodded once. "Do that." Barrett's boots found the road. He looked back only once. It was enough to make a promise to the yard with his eyes. "I will come back a different man, or not at all." "Good," Miss Dunn said, softer than anyone had heard her say anything since Easter 3 years ago when the choir had hit harmony by accident. She fussed, nothing and everything. She tucked the blanket under Sorrel's elbow. She arranged the brick near her feet. She moved Prouse's ledger out of a puddle he would never have noticed. "Eat again after," she told Sorrel. "You look like a fence post that thinks it can be a tree, and I'd rather it not try both at once." Sorrel made a sound that might have been gratitude and might have been a laugh. She shifted because the ache in her hips had found a new opinion. She watched the road where the wagon had vanished and felt the pull in her belly ease and then return like a tide not ready to be finished. Ivor on a wagon, cuffs on his wrists that knew how to hold a coal as if it were a child, the marshal's hat cutting the day into wedges that would not agree. The second rider on the ridge, the words leverage is leverage. Her skin went cold, though the fire held. The door opened inside her chest again, not to grief this time, but to a map. It drew itself without her permission, line by line, with the economy of a hand that had learned to keep secrets. It showed the cottonwood cut and the ankle-breaking rut where spring always stole a wheel. It showed the low ditch where gazebo dreams still lay on a pile after the council's last attempt at adornment. It showed the stand of willows that gave shade to a creek that did not deserve it. It showed the rise at Miller's Acres where a man with a hat too new and a job too old might set up a privatized version of the truth. "We can't sit," she heard herself say. Miss Dunn did not ask who she meant. "No," she agreed, as if she had been on the same map all along. "But you," she tapped the baby's foot with one finger, "you can't go." Sorrel knew. Her bones knew. Her blister knew. Every part of her that had gone to war through the night wanted to go again, but every part of her that had learned mercy's weight said no. The two stood on either side of her spine and argued. "Rollin'," she said, before the arguments could get personal. "Harness Moss and Huckle to the dray. If the road broke, they'll pull the wagon out. Bring rope, not the fancy kind, the kind that has already learned its job." Roland nodded, already moving. He said, "Moss will complain, but he'll pull." "Doc," she said, and he had already stood. "Please," she faltered. The word please was heavier than most and didn't fit her mouth snug. "Please go with them. If the marshal needs convincing, you are the man I'd place between him and the wrong decision." Doc Green's hat found his head like a shy dog. He said, "I intended to be inconvenient. Now I'll do it in a wagon." "Prouse," she said. He started like a boy who has just been called upon in a room where he's been humming a song only he can hear. "Yes," he answered, like a period hopping from foot to foot. You'll meet them at the cottonwood cut with water and blankets and your ledger open to the page where you wrote the draft you didn't mean, and you'll tell the marshal what you meant to write, and you'll say it loud enough that the men from the ridge hear it too." Prowse swallowed, squared, nodded. He looked at the ledger at his feet like a dog who had bitten a child and wanted to be forgiven before it knew how. He said, "I will," and shocked himself by meaning it. "And me?" Miss Dunn asked, eyes bright and not a little wicked. "You," Sorrel said, weighing her in the mouth of her mind, "will decide what kind of man you want to have been when your company writes your obituary." He laughed, quietly. "You think I get to decide?" "I know you do," she said. "You've been deciding all day."
He stood still, as if movement might admit to intention. Then he untied his tie, the tidy piece of string that had been choking him into someone else's voice, and put it in his pocket. "I'll ride ahead," he said. "Not to help, to see. Sometimes the difference is where a man puts his eyes." He swung into the saddle and was gone how decent men leave rooms they are not finished with. Roland had Moss and Huckle hitched in less time than gossip. The dray groaned in the key of forbearance and followed him out. Doc climbed aboard with his bag and a look that said he planned to stop time with gauze. Prowse ran, not a verb he had exercised in years, toward the store to fetch the things he should have already had in his hands. Sorrel stayed. She wanted to go. She knew better than wanting. Her body had begun to tremble from the inside out, small tremors that made the world fuzz at the edges. The baby insisted on the simplicity of hunger and pulled her back into a single present that would not be negotiated with. Sorrel bent and kissed the downy head and tasted the taste that will make parents lie and beg and lift wagons, salt and promise. She let the feeding end when the baby ended it, and not before. She changed the child with hands that had learned steadiness from horses and had never once been taught to braid hair and had decided to regret nothing. She drank more broth. She ate the heel of bread Miss Dunn shoved in her mouth when she wasn't looking. She breathed on the ember when the wind flirted with it and taught it, gently, that this was a place to be stubborn. The yard settled into a waiting more honest than the earlier kind. Roland's hammer was a heartbeat on the farthest edge of hearing. A boy dragged a broom in lazy pride that might one day yet be useful. The bell remembered being on a spire and forgave itself for rolling. An hour, then another. The slant of light remembered its work. Sorrel tried not to count. Counting always broke her heart. Hoofbeats. Not the neat roll of the dray, not the marshal's wagon. A quicker, meaner rhythm. Men who intend to get somewhere before anyone can ask why. Miss Dunn's posture changed to that of a field rabbit who knows when to freeze. Prowse appeared at a dead run from the side street, hat gone, hair making a case for itself. "They've stopped the wagon," he panted. "Not the marshal. Those men. 3 of them. Guns. Company words in their mouths like they were paid to carry them." Sorrel stood. The trembling vanished, or it gathered itself into one place and stood there like a man waiting for an introduction. She set the baby in Miss Dunn's arms again. "Will you—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Miss Dunn's nod was the vow of a saint who had kept a schoolhouse sober for 30 years. "You can't," Doc Green had said to her a lifetime ago about a different thing, and she had, and he had forgiven her for it later. Sorrel went to Nettle. The mare lifted her head and blew into Sorrel's neck as if counting the beats there. "One more time, then we'll sleep. I promise you that, if not to me." She swung up. Not pretty, not easy. Miss Dunn made a small sound that might have been a prayer and might have been restraint. Sorrel kept low. She had only once in her life asked speed from a horse without intending to give it back. She didn't intend to throw that habit away now. She asked something else of Nettle, the long, even trot that builds a road where there hasn't been one yet. The yard watched her go and became a vow in the shape of a circle of bricks. The cottonwood cut looked like it always looked, slouched, guilty, insufficient. Sorrel could see, as she topped the rise, where the road had swallowed the wagon's right wheel like a snake that had misjudged a rabbit.
The marshal stood with his hands on his hips and his mouth making the shape that begins prayers and ends curses. The horses blew and tried to remember better days. The dray was planted behind, Moss sanctimonious, Huckle sweating and happy to be included. Roland had a rope around the wagon's rear axle and was teaching it patience. Dog Green had one foot planted where it would bear the most weight if the Lord ignored math and allowed miracles. And the three men, Tidy Hat's cousins, by their outline if not their arrangement, had their guns out and their contracts tucked where hearts usually ride. One climbed into the wagon and had the cuffs in his hands, like an invitation. Ivor stood, because kneeling would have been indecent, and said something calm enough that the man felt brave enough to move. Sorrel didn't shout. She didn't name. She put Nettle's head toward the man getting into the wagon and asked for that small change of speed that means the difference between apology and statement. The mare obliged with the willingness of a friend asked to lie on your behalf. "Don't," Sorrel said when she was close enough for the man to believe her. He aimed his gun. She saw his hand shake the way men's hands do when they have learned only two verbs, take and shoot. She picked a third for him, drop. She flicked the lead rope with the accuracy of a woman who had spent her whole life persuading animals the world was a safer place than it was. The rope's tip kissed his wrist, his finger convulsed, the gun coughed, the shot scuffed the wagon bed and gave the horses a new argument to make. Ivor didn't flinch. He had already learned all the ways men were going to disappoint him this hour. Roland swore because the rope he had wrapped had to be unwrapped to keep it from pulling the wagon sideways. Prouse made a noise not unlike the noise a ledger makes when the number you wrote turns out to be a confession. Doc Green stepped up onto the wagon tongue with the casual authority of a man boarding a train he'd decided not to pay for. "Put them down," the marshal said, meaning guns. "Put them down," meaning plans. The men did not. Pride is a kind of oxygen. They were breathing it wrong. One set his sights on the marshal's shoulder, because law is a thing that looks like it will go down if you pull it like a curtain. One turned the barrel toward Doc Green, because killing a doctor is a way to make sure no one will patch the holes you're about to make. The third looked at Sorrel and recalculated what a woman on a mare could do to a man with a contract. The world, which had been playing at being simple for half a minute, remembered its job and became complicated again. Kellen Reed arrived from the west at a lope he pretended was an accident. He took in the math and found it intolerable. "Stop," he said. Not piston, not silk, just a voice stripped down to wood. He aimed it at his own kind first. "You're not paid enough to try that." One of the men sneered. "You don't write our checks."